Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. Uh-oh. Got audio problems. Mic. Does it work now? No? Saved? No, not saved. Wait, fixed? You can hear? It's good. I don't see the thing. If you can hear me, say potato. Okay, that's so weird. Okay, I can't see my volume in the mixer, but we'll fix that later. Okay. Okay, this is great because if I didn't have y'all, I wouldn't know. Like, this is fantastic. I can't see anything in the mixer, so we gotta. I'm gonna be relying on you. Okay. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. So Polaritude is saying, rule number 1 of streaming, if you are asking, am I muted or can you hear me, only believe moderator responses. I think that's a good rule, Polaritude. But because of people like you who are looking out for me, since we have people like you in our community, I've actually learned to trust chat a little bit, right? Because there are awesome people like you who are like, hey, don't get taken advantage of by chat. And it turns out there are actually like plenty of people like you that take care of me. So it actually kind of works out. Normally I would agree with you, but it seems like people are pretty legit. And thank you for watching out for me. I appreciate it. And okay, so let's get started. So something super cool I want to share with y'all today. So we're in week 3 of our Swap It Challenge. And for those of you that don't know, our Swap It Challenge has now, I think, we've had 750 hours of stuff that has been swapped out. So Swap It is an opportunity to swap out bad habits for good ones. And anytime you swap out a task, it contributes points to the community pool. And then as we contribute points to the community pool, we hit reward milestones. So you can sign up on Discord, participate on Discord. And basically what the Swap It Challenge is all about is taking like mindless technology use and swapping it out for something productive. And thus far, we've swapped out 750 hours of mindless technology use by the community, and doing like productive things instead. So I guess we've hit our first community milestone, which is 500,000 points. So there's a special role for participants. Once we hit 1 million, we're going to have a Saturday of jam-packed events on Discord. And I guess if we hit 2 million, I guess I'm doing an ASMR stream. So there's that. Some contributors, the top contributors, will also get $50 of store merch and access to Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. So this is the key thing about the Swap It Challenge is you can't like do a ton all at once, right? So this is about building healthy technology or healthy habits over time. And so there's a maximum amount of stuff that you can swap out per week. We're on week 3 now, so you can swap out 15 minutes worth of unhealthy technology usage with something better and accumulate up to 200 points. And so we've got different kinds of point multipliers that y'all can do, like going to social sandboxes, Ask a Coach, life crafting, some of our other Discord events. And so the goal of this is that, I'm sure y'all know this by this point, but like basically when we use technology, it messes with our dopamine circuitry, and it can be hard to sort of stop using technology. So we've implemented the Swap It Challenge to help y'all sort of overcome that. So the goal is to swap out tech use for other tasks and submit photos and win points. So tasks include things like self-care, exercise, touch grass, environment care, creative stuff. And you can even like include activities that aren't on our list. This is just what most of the people in the community are trying to do. So join the Discord. You can, in any text channel, you can type /swapit, submit, I guess. And then you can input your task and upload a photo. So by all means, join up and start swapping out bad habits for good ones. Make sense? Questions? Couple of other quick announcements. So we've got today at 3 p.m. Central Time, about almost 3 hours from now, we've got Coach Tom, who will be talking about dopamine, meditation together, and take questions. I don't know what meditation is, but it's Coach Tom is going to be talking about Coach Tom, not to be confused with Coach Tom, is going to be talking about it on Discord. For those of you all that don't know Coach Tom, he's an awesome coach. And so he'll be there, and it's the website is explore.healthygamer.gg/swap-it. But y'all can just join the Discord and you can go to the Swap It channel from there. So we're going to be talking about dopamine, meditation, and taking questions. And then at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, we've got an Ask a Coach event around shame. We're going to be looking at shame today in one of our posts. So if y'all are interested in that, then definitely check that out on Wednesday. I'm sure we'll let y'all know on Wednesday as well. So today on stream, we're going to do a couple of cool things. One is there's an article from Psychology Today that's been making the rounds, and it's about loneliness and men and a little bit about dating and things like that. So we're going to be touching on that, talking a little bit about what's going on, what the data actually shows. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about being a filler friend. So if you're someone who's in social situations and you're kind of like around, but you're not really like a part of things and you kind of get left behind, we're going to be talking a little bit about how people end up in that situation and what to do about it. And lastly, we're going to be talking about shame. So a little bit about where shame comes from and how to deal with it. So the cool thing is we've done some content on shame already. And the neat thing is, as we do some content on shame, people in our community will apply some of those teachings. So this person in particular has found a meditative practice that's very, very helpful for them. And also the meditation only does so much. And so now the cool thing is we're going to go into shame in more of an advanced and complete way and really try to understand what are the different levels within ourself that shame comes from and how it manifests, and how certain interventions we do for shame may work in some dimensions, but don't really address shame on all levels of our being. So I know it sounds kind of weird, but like shame can be an emotion. It can also be like a sense of identity, if that kind of makes sense, right? So I can't be ashamed of myself unless I have a particular identity of myself that I fall short of. So how do you tackle shame on multiple dimensions? Because the challenge is that if we're working on shame, there'll be people who will say like, okay, so meditation helps with shame. And then you start meditating and it helps some, but it doesn't fix the problem. And so how can we sort of learn more advanced perspectives on shame so that we can start to grapple with it a little bit better? Okay? So we're going to start with the article. So there's been an article that's been, as I would put it, making the rounds. So this article about the rise of lonely single men was written by a PsyD and talks about how dating opportunities for heterosexual men are diminishing as relationship standards rise. Men represent approximately 62% of dating app users, lowering their chances for matches. Men need to address skill deficits to meet healthier relationship expectations. So I've been linked to this article by multiple people, which is part of why we're addressing it. And today what I'd love to do is talk a little bit about, is there a rise of lonely single men? If there is a rise, why that's happening and what we understand about, where this is coming from. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what makes it hard for people to be empathic to single lonely men. And I think men have a hand in that. So we're going to talk a little bit about why this is such a hot topic. So even already, I want y'all to pay attention to yourself. And as I say I'm going to talk about this, notice the emotional reaction that you're having. right? So maybe you're sort of thinking like, oh, this is fantastic that Dr. K is talking about this. This really needs to be addressed. Or maybe you're thinking, oh my God, not another discussion about, toxic, lonely single men. And we're going to be sort of exploring that sort of reaction and why that happens. And both are completely valid perspectives. We're also going to touch a little bit. We've done this foray a couple of times, sometimes very unsuccessfully. We're going to talk a little bit about gender dynamics, just sort of in a general sense. And this is something that I think has been a hot button issue for the internet. And it's been a hot button issue for us. But what we're sort of noticing in our community is that it's an ongoing concern for so many people. And I have faith that if we kind of keep trying, we'll eventually sort of figure out how to sort of deal with this kind of stuff in a healthier way. The other thing that we're going to address today is sort of how to critically read articles. So we're going to not only be looking at this article and sort of like tunneling down a little bit about the editorial process and things like that, because sometimes, I don't know if y'all are kind of aware of this, but like, Psychology Today and other publications are trying to get views, right? So they'll sort of pick titles and things like that are kind of quite inflammatory and will create emotional reactions. But we're going to tunnel down and look a little bit more critically at the sources that are cited, what the actual sources say. And I encourage all of you to really be critical when you're reading articles. So instead of sort of rejecting this article because it doesn't agree with your worldview, or, gobbling it up without any sort of critical thought because it mirrors your own experience, what I think we really need to do, especially as articles are getting more and more clickbaity, is to sort of think a little bit critically about the points that they're making and what's supported by data and what isn't. I want to check in with y'all for a second about, first of all, how do y'all feel about this? Is this okay for us to talk about? Are these like acceptable goals? Is there an acceptable sort of nuanced or critical way to look at this? Okay, awesome. So there's going to be a couple dimensions. We're not just going to be talking about this. We're also going to be talking about gender dynamics and critically looking at articles. Okay? So it's going to be like, it's not just, it's so simple. This is what's going on. Men are screwed, period. End of it. No, it's so much more nuanced than that. Okay? So let's start with a couple of acknowledgments just about gender in general. Okay? So something that's going on right now on the internet is that people will talk about a specific gender-related issue. So for example, this article cites multiple things that are specific to men. So this article will say things like, it's more challenging for men on dating apps because 62% of dating app users are men. They also cite other sources, for example, that say that 46% of men will swipe right or will like or move forward with a particular dating profile, whereas 14% of women will swipe right or like or whatever the equivalent is, right? So we can look at those statistics, and what a lot of people will conclude is, see, things on dating apps are harder for men than they are for women. Now, this is a perspective that I think we've got to be really, really careful about. Because remember that anytime there's a particular article, there may be particular dimensions that are more difficult for men, but it doesn't necessarily mean that online dating is easier for men as a whole than it is for women. So for example, there may be some things which are in quote unquote women's favor or against men, but then there are other things that are like in favor of men as opposed to women. So for example, intimate intrusions online, studying the normalization of abuse in dating apps, or online inclusivity or sexual harassment, conceptualizing women's experiences in the digital age. These are both primary literature studies, right? So these are not like editorial articles. These are peer-reviewed published research. My point is that if we're going to wade into gender dynamics, we need to understand that just because a particular thing is easier or harder for a particular gender in a particular place does not mean that that gender has it harder globally or has it easier globally. Do y'all get that? This is a huge thing that, you kind of learn in medicine. And just to give y'all a very simple example. So just because breast cancer is more common than testicular cancer doesn't mean that it isn't hard for people to get testicular cancer, that it sucks if people get testicular cancer or, any of those other things. When you are a practicing physician, what you start to learn is that there's sort of the global population stuff, which may be true. So for example, breast cancer may be more common than testicular cancer. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change the experience of the person with testicular cancer. And just because some of the statistics cited in this paper, which we'll also interpret, right, so that's really important, may suggest that things are harder for men, and I think that that's probably to a certain degree true in this particular dimension, it in no way translates into invalidating like the difficulty that women have on dating apps. And this is sort of what we're learning as a society as a whole, which is that men and women and non-binary people or trans people, by virtue of our genders, we tend to experience life in a different way, right? And that just because a particular gender has difficulty in a particular realm does not mean that that gender has it easy in all kinds of realms, or that it's more beneficial on a whole to be that gender. Now, some people may make those arguments, and there may be statistics to kind of back that up. But in my overwhelming experience as a clinician, like, the key thing to remember is, first of all, different genders have different experiences of things in life. And that each gender, no matter whether you're a man, a woman, trans, non-binary, whatever, is going to face unique challenges. And our goal here is to understand the world, understand ourselves, and help people. And in part of that process, what we have to do is acknowledge the individual challenges that a particular demographic may face. That in no way invalidates the experience or should be compared to the experience of other people. I just don't think that's useful, right? So if someone ends up with testicular cancer, you don't want to say, well, screw you because way more people have breast cancer. Now, on the flip side, there may be unequal treatment, which is sort of appropriate there, which is like, okay, so for example, if breast cancer is way more common than testicular cancer, do we want to mandate mammograms for mandating mastectomies would be terrible. Mandating mammograms for women over the age of 50, whereas we don't necessarily need to take an X-ray of people's scrotums once they're over 50 years old. So by virtue of the difference in size of a problem, we may need to sort of individually create tailored solutions, which sort of makes sense medically, right? So we sort of treat genders somewhat differently, and that's based on data. But at the end of the day, what I would really hope happens from this talk is anything that we're going to say about acknowledging men's difficulties does not necessarily relate to anything that is happening with women's difficulties. And that actually, by comparing those two things, I think we're actually doing a disservice to everyone. Because just because there are more men on dating apps, the challenges that women face on dating apps is different, right? So there's a lot more research that shows that women are more likely to experience sexual harassment, sexual assault than men by virtue of online dating and things like that. So each gender is going to have its own individual problems. And what we're trying to really do is understand what are the problems that affect this particular gender in this particular moment, and what can we do about it? And then we can also do that for other genders and other situations and other demographics. Does that make sense? Are we okay with me continuing to talk about this? Or is it not acceptable to talk about challenges that men face in the dating realm unless we are at the same time talking about the challenges that women face or making it comparative in nature? Because here's the thing, gender dynamics is not a competition, right? Like, things are hard for men and things are hard for women. Some of the things that are hard for men and women are actually the same, but some of them, shockingly, are different. And so if we really want to try to help people, we have to acknowledge what those differences are and address them individually. Does that make sense? It's not a competition. All right. Do you need you're damn right I need your permission. So people are asking, do you need our permission? Yeah, I want, it's not so much about permission as it is approval, right? So this is where, like, if y'all are not comfortable with continuing this conversation, if this is not a conversation that we should move forward in, then we can stop. Got it? Okay. And by the way, if people think that I'm overstepping or misplaying or anything like that, please let us know, because all of that feedback is actually being instrumental in getting us to this point and helping us gain this nuanced understanding. Okay, let's go. So let's take a quick look at the article. So, younger and middle-aged men are the loneliest they've ever been in generations, and it's probably going to get worse. This is not my typical rosy view of relationships, but a reality nonetheless. Over the last 30 years, men have become a larger portion of that growing group of long-term single people. And while you don't actually need to be in a relationship to be happy, men are typically happier and healthier when partnered. Here are the three broad trends in the relationship landscape that suggest heterosexual men are in for a rough road ahead. Dating apps. Whether you're just starting to date or you're recently divorced and dating again, dating apps are a huge driver for new romantic connections in the US. The only problem is that upwards of 62% of users are men, and many women are overwhelmed with how many options. And many women are overwhelmed with how many options they have. Competition in online dating is fierce, and lucky in-person chance encounters with dreamy partners are rarer than ever. So let's stop for a second and try to look at this a little bit critically. So the first thing to understand is that this piece, so let me ask y'all a question. Is this piece fact or is it opinion? What do y'all think? Right? So these statements, right? So it's interesting. So there's a lot of confusion. So some people are saying fact and some people are saying opinion. So I think this is a prime example of like what to be careful of when you read an article on something like Psychology Today. I have no doubt that Greg Matos, PsyD, is a very knowledgeable, it looks like he's specializes in relationship therapy. So I have no doubt that he's very confident. But a lot of this stuff is opinion. So for example, this is why it's important to read things critically. So 62% of users are men. So what is the source of this? It's an article from Time magazine. So according to a new study, which then goes to over here, so the source is actually just another news article. I couldn't even get access to the primary study. The other interesting thing is that this source is from 2015. So here we are in 2022, citing a statistic that says that 62% of users are men, that this statistic is 7 years old. So do y'all think that's still valid? Right? And like, I can't even find the actual article. Like, I can't find the actual source this comes from. This is a Time magazine article. This is not peer-reviewed research. Now, I'm not saying that the person's premise isn't correct, and he does cite better research elsewhere. My point is that we just need to be critical of what we read, okay? So, and this is where competition in online dating is fierce, and lucky in-person chance encounters are rarer than ever. Many women are overwhelmed with how many options they have. So this is the kind of statement that I don't know if this is true. Right? So they cite this statistic, but where are they getting this idea? Right? So this is where, like, we've got to be a little bit careful, because oftentimes what happens is when you have an article like this, people will make statements like this that are very triggering. So if you're a woman reading this and you're like, I'm not overwhelmed with how many options I have, that's not my problem at all. This person has no idea what they're talking about. And if you're a dude, you're like, yeah, you're damn right. Like, I can't get a single match. And all these women on dating apps have like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of matches, and they must be overwhelmed. Oh, what's wrong? Like, you're so overwhelmed with the thousands of matches that you're getting? So these kinds of statements create emotional reactions. And what we're seeing on the internet is that these are the kinds of like statements that people deeply resonate with or find quite inflammatory, right? I don't think that this person is like in the wrong for saying things like this, because we'll get to where they get this in a second, okay? So, but we just need to be critical about it, right? So this is this person's opinion. The person is absolutely allowed to have an opinion, and if that's this person's experience, that's actually totally fair. We just need to be critical with how we're reading it. With so many options, it's not surprising that women are increasingly selective. I do a live TikTok show, A Better Love Project, and speak with hundreds of audience members every week. I hear recurring dating themes from women between the ages of 25 and 45. They prefer men who are emotionally available, good communicators, and share similar values. So let's think about this for a second. So I'm getting the sense that this person's perspective on women is coming from a live TikTok show where they discuss things with audience members, right? So this, once again, it's useful perspective to have, right? It's, in fact, the same perspective that we often use, which is that we like to talk to people directly in our community and try to, sort of get individual perspectives, anecdotal evidence. The difference is that we also, maybe this person does too, so who knows? But that's also why we have a robust research arm at Healthy Gamer, right? So we have 5 or 6 IRB approved studies that we're running because we actually don't know when we interview someone on stream or do a call-in show or respond to a post, is this actually representative of the community? That's why you do research. But this is this person's perspective, totally fine. So they're sort of pointing out that what we sort of find is that there are men who, women want men who are emotionally available, good communicators, and share similar values. And then the article goes on to say, for men, this means a relationship skills gap. If not addressed, will likely lead to fewer dating opportunities. Less patience for poor communication skills, longer periods of being single, et cetera, et cetera. The problem for men is that emotional connection is the lifeblood of a long, healthy term relationship. They also talk a little bit about, they're a little bit hopeful, right? So while there's no chance of stemming the rising tide of unintentional single men, there is good news. Algorithms are becoming increasingly more complex on dating apps and other online platforms. Hinge apparently has a beta trial that 90% of their users liked their first date. How can men reap the benefit of the algorithms? Level up your mental health game. That means getting into some individual therapy to address your skills gap. It means valuing your internal world and respecting your ideas. It means seeing intimacy, romance, emotional connection as worthy of your time and effort. Ultimately, we have an opportunity to revolutionize romantic relationships, and establish healthy norms, starting with a first date. It's likely that some of these romances will be transformative and healing, disrupting generational trauma and establishing a fresh culture of admiration and validation. Sounds fantastic. Men have a key role in this transformation, but only if they go all in. It's going to take that kind of commitment to themselves, to their own mental health, and to the kind of love that they want to generate in this world. Will we step up? Now, this also, I think I take a slight issue with this last statement, because this implies that the challenges of the rise of single, lonely men are predominantly something that they need to fix. The question is, will we as men step up? It doesn't actually address what's kind of interesting, which we'll get to, which is what these papers actually say about why men are lonely, right? So these papers, as we're going to tunnel down into, these papers don't actually say that emotional unavailability is responsible for the lack of men in their ability to date. Okay, this person's own citations actually say different things. So let's take a quick look at what the papers. So these are the papers that this person cited. Okay, let's look at what's going on. So, loneliness around the world: age, gender, and cultural differences in loneliness. The BBC Loneliness Experiment provided a unique opportunity to examine the differences in the experiences of loneliness across cultures, age, and gender, and interaction between these factors. Blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Findings show that loneliness increased with individualism, decreased with age, and was greater in men than women. We also found that age, gender, and culture interacted to predict loneliness, although those interactions do not qualify the main effects and simply accentuated them. We found the most vulnerable to loneliness were younger men living in individualistic cultures. Now, this is really important because what this paper essentially finds is that young men living in individualistic cultures, so that's primarily Western cultures like the US, Canada, Europe, right, that sort of emphasize an individual mentality over, the collective. So, for example, maybe parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, maybe parts of Africa, for example, these communities are more like, these cultures are more community driven. And so it turns out that, when this person says, oh yeah, younger and middle-aged men are the loneliest they've ever been, generationally, this is correct. But we got to tunnel down a little bit further. So as we go down and we look at it, let's see what the authors of the paper actually say. The finding that loneliness was higher in individualistic compared to collectivist cultures should be interpreted with caution. The vast majority of participants resided in individualistic countries, especially the UK. That does not explain why the effect was stronger for men and younger people. Okay? We propose that there is something about individualism that enhances loneliness, particularly if other risk factors are present. So that's kind of interesting. We found that loneliness was higher among men than women, which is contrary to the findings from the ONS 2018 survey. Oh, interesting. So it seems like in previous research, this has not been found to be the case. So that might mean that men need particular conditions to speak about loneliness, et cetera, et cetera. You all can read this paper if you want to. It's in the public domain. So here's another thing to mention. As already indicated, it must also be kept in mind that we used a large non-representative sample of participants who volunteered to speak about their feelings of loneliness. Finally, it is important to acknowledge that the effects we found were very small, although consistent across all dimensions. We take this to mean that those effects are real and loneliness is a fairly universal experience across demographic categories. Data also provided by a large sample of individuals found different ages and from a large number of different countries, thus providing statistical power. The key thing here is that if we actually look at the effect sizes of gender, and I'm a little bit rusty on statistics, but I think this is a relatively small effect size, right? So we're talking about 7% to 10, I guess, 0.07, negative 0.07 to 0.1 is a relatively small effect size. So while this paper says it is true that young men from individual cultures are the most lonely group that we've been able to find, that number, they're not so much more lonely than other people, right? They are lonelier, but not by a whole lot. And that's where we've got to be really careful, because when someone pairs this kind of statistic, right? And now we start to see something that's kind of interesting, because like this person just uses the word loneliness. He doesn't say lonely by a very small margin. And then when we see 62% of users are men, based on research from 2015, we start to construct this idea that there's an epidemic of lonely single men. Now, I do think that this is true, but I don't think that the gender dynamic is as disparate as people think it is. And that's what the research would suggest. The other really, really devastating thing about this that I was really kind of hesitant on is this person talks about fixing a skill deficit, which we're going to talk to y'all today a little bit about how to do that. Because even though I disagree with some of the statistics, I think the point that the person says is very good, which is that generally speaking, women, may be looking for emotionally available, good communicators, and that probably correlates with health and happiness in relationships. So we're going to teach y'all a little bit later about how to be emotionally available. What does that actually mean, right? Because everyone's like, oh, like I'm looking for someone who's emotionally available. And if you're listening to that, it's like, okay, how do I do that? We're going to teach y'all. This is what's kind of interesting. So this person also cites this article, which is from the Pew Research Center, okay? So Pew Research Center is a pretty legitimate research organization, but once again, not necessarily peer-reviewed scientific publication. But the interesting thing is that as you tunnel down into what the Pew Research Center shows, it doesn't talk about, men being single because of emotional unavailability. What it actually talks about is kind of interesting. So let me try to find this. The growing gap in economic success between partnered and unpartnered adults may have consequences for single men who would eventually like to find a partner. In a 2017 Pew Research Center survey, 71% of adults said being able to support a family financially is very important for a man to be a good spouse or partner. Similar shares of men and women said this, right? So 71% of both men and women, or 71% of men and women believe, or 71% of adults in an equal share of men and women believe that it's important for a man to be able to financially support a family. In contrast, 32% of adults and just 25% of men said this is a very important for a woman to be a good spouse or partner. So if you really look at what men and women value in terms of being partnered, this is a staggering difference between the genders, right? A 32 versus 71% difference in terms of how important is being able to financially support a family in terms of like for a man versus a woman. So what we start to see is like a lot of interesting things, right? So if you look at unpartnered versus partnered adults, right? So unpartnered adults are 29% of them have completed a bachelor's degree, whereas 41% of partnered adults have a bachelor's degree. We start to see a difference between are employed, 75 versus 82%, right? 35,000 median income versus 49,000 median income. That's pretty wild. We're talking about a 40% increase in income that results in being partnered. There's also interesting things like living at home, right? So the percentage of partnered people who live at home. So if you're in a relationship, 2% of people live at home. Whereas if you're not in a relationship, 28% of people are living at home. So as this table kind of goes down, what we start to see is that men who are unpartnered, 73% of them are employed, whereas 91% of them who have partnered men are employed. Whereas if you look at the gap for women, 74 versus 77%, this implies that employment is a far greater aspect for men in relationships than women. Right? Now, I'm not saying that this is universally true. We're just looking at statistics critically. Because the really interesting thing here is that this paper that this person cites over here to support his argument that men are lonely doesn't actually have anything to do with emotional availability. Right? This, like a percentage of people that are financially vulnerable, the partnered men, 13%. Whereas unpartnered men, 36%, whereas women tends to be like pretty even. Okay? So the point here is that as we're looking at this, we have to be kind of critical. Because what the data actually suggests is that if you look at men versus women and people who are partnered and unpartnered, according to this one Pew Research survey, right? What it seems to imply is that economic stability in terms of for a man, leads to a far greater impact on their relationship success than a woman. Now, if you're a woman who's out there in the audience and you're saying, if you take issue with that, like that's totally fine. You're allowed to take issue with it. You're allowed to be critical of it. I'm not saying that this is truth. This is just one Pew Research survey, which sort of demonstrates this. The reason that we're bringing it up is because if you're reading an article like this and it says be more emotionally available, we've got to be kind of careful about where that direction is coming from. So I do think it's very important for men to become more emotionally available. Like, I think that's like really, really important. We're going to talk about that in a second. But let's just be a little bit clear about, is there a rise of lonely single men? Sure. But it's not like, it's not as it's not as imbalanced according to the sources we looked at today. That we're looking at a relatively small effect size for men as compared to women. We also are living in a society where I think part of the reason that men really struggle to find relationships is because as we've started to see an improvement in equality in the workplace, we have not seen a similar cultural shift, right? So for example, there's still like a lot of, lack of equality in the workplace. Like 17 to 21% of people who graduate with engineering degrees are women, right? So it's still like an 80% dominated field, but we're seeing some progress in some areas. So now, for example, 52 to 55% of medical students are women as opposed to men, right? So we're seeing evening out in some fields, a lack of evening out in other fields. I've seen tons and tons of stories about misogyny in like video game development and things like that. So I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory for women in the workplace, but what we are seeing is that it appears that both men and women are likely to judge a man more harshly for a lack of employment than a woman, right? So that's what the research sort of suggests. Now, let's take a moment to like understand why this narrative that single lonely men gets attacked. So I think sometimes what happens is when people are lonely, they start to become a little bit toxic, right? So there's a community of men who's sort of like super into the toxic masculinity, is quite misogynistic. And so what we tend to see is that you're lonely, there's all of these like men out there that are sort of engaged in this kind of like toxic masculinity approach let's forget about toxic masculinity. Let's just call it misogyny. And then what tends to happen, what I've observed is that as people respond to the misogyny, right, both men and women who are like, hey, stop being an asshole, what it actually does is as you attack the misogyny, what you're sort of doing is that you're kind of disregarding the loneliness at the root, which sort of makes sense, right? So if I'm lonely and I start to become an asshole and people like don't like that I'm being an asshole and criticize me for being an asshole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that sort of makes sense. And what it actually does is bypasses the fact that I'm lonely to begin with. So it's almost like what's happening is we're getting an invalidation of lonely men, because as lonely men gravitate towards polarizing figures that are misogynistic, and remember, this is the internet, so the more inflammatory your perspective, the more likely it's to be upvoted. So there's like this rise of misogyny. There's a devaluation of the misogyny. And in the devaluation of the misogyny, what you're having with it is a devaluation of the underlying loneliness. Right? Does that make sense? Because it's hard to say when someone is being like cruel and sexist that, oh yeah, like you're suffering too, like your underlying points are valid. Because all we do is respond to that toxicity at the top. And so this is something that's, I think, really, really devastating, because what's happening is that in an effort to try to support these lonely men, what we're actually doing is adopting views that are very justifiably criticized. But in justifiably criticizing those particular views, we're actually invalidating the core of the problem. And this is what's so hard about it, is if I'm a lonely single man and there's a crowd of people who are invalidating a select group of misogynistic people who are like, you know, promoting connection in their own way, right? Well, getting laid or whatever, right? Like what we're sort of doing is we're losing sight of the fact that the people that resonate with those communities are lonely to begin with, and that's a real problem. Do y'all get that? Like, it's nuanced. Like, the complaints, I think, are valid. It's the adaptation to the complaint, which is also justifiably criticized, but the root of the loneliness is absolutely there. And I do think that this is a real problem, right? So this is not like just because research suggests that, you know, the discrepancy between men and women is not that big, that's irrelevant. Like, it's not a competition, right? If there are lonely men and lonely women, we should address both of those things. And saying that, oh, it's not like men are much more lonely than women doesn't actually help, because there's still a gigantic pile of lonely men. You can't invalidate just because I've got testicular cancer and someone else has breast cancer. It doesn't mean, oh, you've got testicular cancer, this person has breast cancer, so screw everybody. No, both of these people need help. Right? Like, loneliness is a problem for each gender, and the reasons for the loneliness can be specific and gender specific. And there are, for example, like differential experiences with dating apps. And even though the Time article said in 2015, you know, it's dated, but they cited that 14% of women swipe right versus 46% of men swipe right. Right? And if that's true, that's a staggering difference in terms of dating behavior, and will probably be affecting men and women differently. Now, why do women swipe right on 14% of the time? Who knows? Maybe does it have to do with employment? Does it have to do with median income? Does it have to do with emotional availability? Like, who knows? And just because women are more selective on dating apps than men doesn't mean that women have it easy on dating apps. Y'all get that? Like, you can have an advantage as a gender, but that doesn't mean that, like, on the blanket that everything is easy for you. Because most of the time when I hear about complaints around dick pics, inappropriate sexual behavior, things like that, right? It's like the women who are complaining. So it's not like they have it easy. And this is what we've got to be really careful about, is if we want to try to help people, we can't invalidate someone's perspective just because we're suffering. It's not a competition, and it's not like the amount of help to go around is limited. What limits it is our own perspective. What limits the amount of help is like the compassion that we give or don't give when someone else says I'm struggling. Now, let's talk for a second about, so just to kind of summarize, you know, I think this is a good article. I think it's an opinion, and it's important to remember that this is opinion. If you find it inflammatory or if you find it validating, both are reasonable perspectives. As we tunnel down into the research, I think the story that they sort of end up telling is very different from what the research actually suggests. That's important to remember. Is there a rise of single lonely men? Yes. Is the most vulnerable population for loneliness in today's world young men from individual cultures? That is also a factual statement. Turns out that the size is not that big. The discrepancy is actually not that big. But the reasons for the partnered versus unpartnered, right? The reasons to be in a relationship do seem to be heavily influenced by gender. So I think we live in a world where despite an improvement in equality between men and women, there is a lag of social acceptance for employment and financial related issues for men. Now, this is where, like, you know, a lot of the pro-men kind of people will talk about, oh, like, all you got to do is make money and grind and all this kind of stuff, and that's all women care about. I think that's a simplistic view, right? I don't think that that's the case. And anyone who kind of says, if you want to attract a man, all you need to do is this. If you want to attract a woman, all you need to do is this, has no idea that, like, I don't know if you'll get this, but men and women are human beings that have individual preferences. And some women don't care about how much their partner makes, and some women do. Some men do care about how much their partner makes, and some men don't. I know it's shocking, but the behaviors of a gender cannot be reduced to a gender, and there's individual variation. Like, I know this is kind of weird as well, but there are actually some men who don't even want to sleep with women. Can you all believe that? And there are some women who are actually not interested in dating a man, no matter how much money they have. Right? Like, there are individual variances amongst people. And so we've got to remember that. Now, let's move on to one last thing from the article. I know, it's bizarre. It's bizarre. You know, wait till some of those, you know, some of the the pickup artist crew figures that out. They're going to be shocked. All right. So let's talk about emotional availability for a second. So, like, if you're in this situation, and I think the article is decent, right? So it's Psychology Today. So, you know, it's going to be an opinion piece that's written by someone who's got a bunch of experience, cites a couple of statistics, and then sort of concludes that men need to rise up and step up to the challenge of emotional availability. I don't quite agree with that, because I think a lot of this is societal, right? So I think that as you look, if 71% of people think that men need to have, you know, be able to financially support a job versus 32% of women, financially support a family versus 32% of women believe that, you know, a woman should financially support a family. And the economy is getting worse. We're getting, you know, wage stagnation. We're sort of seeing more inflation. More people are living at home and things like that. Those economic forces, I think, are adversely affecting men more so than women in terms of a dating world, okay? That too, if you disagree with, you're more than welcome to disagree with it. I haven't done a thorough, like, literature search on it. I'm just using the sources that were cited in the article to come to that conclusion. And hopefully I think that's a pretty fair conclusion, right? So according to Pew Research, we see different things in men and women in terms of income and stuff. So as, like, financially the world gets harder, it's affecting men disproportionately to women. So in terms of dating. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that things are easy for women in this current world, because there are going to be other things that are going on today. For example, the ease of which you can get doxxed and get stalked and things like that, that I think are disproportionately affecting women, right? So society is changing, and each gender is getting screwed in different ways. And trying to, like, compete about it is, like, not worth our time. So what does it mean to be emotionally available? So this is where we've been trying to figure out what is the mechanism through which coaching works. So what we tend to see is that when people come into coaching, they form better relationships. They actually do better professionally. You know, they start to form healthier boundaries and things like that. So, like, they form better relationships with family members. They even will start to date, form better relationships with things like roommates and romantic partners and stuff like that. Your mileage may vary, but we've seen this general trend. So we were trying to figure out, okay, how does this happen? And what we sort of settled on was this concept of emotional quotient, or EQ. So when we talk about emotional availability, I think a really good way to think about this is having a low EQ versus a high EQ. And the components of EQ are things like awareness of what you are feeling. Another thing is the ability to self-regulate what you are feeling. A third thing is being able to communicate what you are feeling. A fourth thing is to be able to set aside what you are feeling in an effort, in the ability to be empathic to someone else. And the fifth thing is an understanding of how your emotions influence your behaviors, okay? So I'm going to share a story with y'all. So a couple of years ago, I had a client who was sort of in this situation where they had this surprise set up for Valentine's Day for their significant other. They were going to take them to a particular like cool place in town. They'd made reservations and stuff like that, right? So, and it turns out that a couple weeks before, because this is like the happen in a new place. So a couple weeks before, it turns out that their significant other is out with their friends, and they spontaneously decide to go to that same location. So in the client's mind, like they had sort of set everything up to have this like magical Valentine's Day experience. And their partner goes there and checks it out kind of on their own with other friends. They're also like, so there's a client is male, their significant other is female. And so they're also like men in the group and things like that. So this is the kind of situation where this person has invested a lot of time and energy to create a wonderful surprise for their partner, and their partner goes and ruins it. Okay? Ruins it by going on their own. And now this person really struggles because, like, did their partner actually do anything wrong? No, not at all. Like, they were out with their friends. They decided to go hit up that place. And it's like, the other thing is, like, it's a surprise, right? Like, so it's not like the partner knew, like, if they had told them, hey, by the way, I made reservations. I think it's going to be, like, awesome. I want to, like, celebrate this, like, new opening with you on Valentine's Day. It's not like they communicated it. They're trying to make it a surprise. And so this person felt really resentful, right? Like, oh my God, like you took this, like, oh, this beautiful night is now ruined. But you can't really criticize the partner for it because the partner really didn't know, right? Like, so she wasn't really doing anything wrong and it's still ruined. So what do you do in that situation? So you can't criticize them because you know they didn't do anything wrong. So, but that feeling of resentment and stuff like that starts to come out in a lot of passive aggressive behavior. Did you have fun? Yeah, it was great. Are you upset about something? No, I'm not upset. Forget it. We don't need to hang out this weekend. I gotta study. I've got a final coming up. Why don't you make other plans for Valentine's Day? And then like the SO's like, wait, what's going, like, I'm confused. Or did I do something wrong? No, you didn't do anything wrong. Right? So what does this mean? Let's look at it. Awareness of the emotion. Does this person have awareness of the emotion? No. Sort of, right? They understand that they feel resentful, kind of. Can they communicate it? Like, they don't really even know what to communicate because it feels so stupid to them. So they're not able to regulate that emotion because it's like, you ruined it even though I can't fault you for it, but you still ruined it. Right? And so, like, because you know the criticism isn't fair. And so that you're unable to self-regulate, you're not really aware of what you're feeling. You certainly can't communicate it, right? Because you don't know what you're feeling, and it feels so petty. It feels so damn petty. And then what happens is you're not aware of how your emotions shape your behavior. So you know you're angry with them, but you can't be kind of like mature about it, right? So like you start playing this passive-aggressive kind of game. And then your partner is really confused about it. You can't really communicate with them. So this is an example of what being emotionally unavailable means. So another good example of this that sometimes is more common in men than women is problem solving versus listening. So oftentimes, these are like general kind of accepted things. I actually haven't seen a bunch of great research, especially recently, about this stuff. So I think some of this stuff may be dated. But you know, there's this impression that men are more problem solving and women are more like supportive when dealing with problems. Okay, so like, I don't care if men are more this way or women are more that way. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that for you to understand that if you're in a relationship, what does it mean to be emotionally available? It's to ask yourself, when your partner comes to you with a problem, something that is not going well in their life, for you to stop for a second and think about, what is this person looking for? Are they looking for help and solutions, or are they looking to vent? And oftentimes a big mistake that a lot of people will make is that they'll try to provide solutions when someone really just wants to vent, right? It's like, you know, oh man, like my place is such a mess. You know, it's like, there's like, I don't even know where to start. And it's like, okay, here, let's get a piece of paper. I set an alarm for Sunday at 9 a.m. and let's make a list of things for you to clean. Clean this first, take out the trash, sort through your mail, do this, do this, do this, do this. And it's like the person knows how to do that. They're just, it's like, wow, yeah, that sucks. You ever get to the point where in cleaning where you're like, I don't need to clean yet, I don't need to clean yet, I don't need to clean yet. And then suddenly there's too much to clean, right? Those responses are very different. Y'all get that? So I do think emotional availability is important. Is it arguably more important for men? Sure. So there's older research that suggests that, men are raised in a particular way, that they learn to manage their emotions differently. Are women looking for emotionally available men? I assume so. I think that men are also looking for emotionally available women. And what are we basing that on? We're basing that on what people say when they call in to a TikTok show about dating. Right? But this is the other thing. Sometimes people will say things when they call into shows that are actually different from what they're actually looking for. So when it comes to, for example, like dating research, it seems like what leads to more success is a better median income, a college degree, being able to live and support a family and things like that. So at the end of the day, though, I think that becoming more emotionally available is like really fantastic for men, women, and everyone involved. Like EQ improvement is good for all human beings. Do men need some more improvement on that? Maybe need some instruction on that more so than women? Maybe. So that's why what we're sort of talking about is, okay, what is emotional availability? It comes down to a couple of things. First is awareness of your emotions. Second thing is the ability to regulate your emotions, the ability to communicate your emotions, the ability to set aside your emotions for the sake of empathy, right? And try to understand the other person's perspective or feel what the other person is feeling. And the last is to be aware of how your emotions influence your behavior. Does that make sense? So hopefully, this was an acceptable foray into the rise of lonely young men. Do I think it's a problem? Yeah. Do I think that young men from individualistic cultures are the most at-risk group for loneliness? Sure. And it turns out that we've got to be a little bit careful because I don't think they're lonely just because they don't know how to be emotionally available. I think if you look at the research, there's a lot of very real demographic and worldly factors that are contributing to this, including what people are looking for in terms of a mate, and also how the world makes it hard to be those things because of very real economic forces. And does emotional availability play into it? Absolutely. But I think we've got to be very, very careful about assuming that the responsibility lies solely with men. Right? So anytime we're looking at gender dynamics, we want to be careful about, whatever the gender is and whatever we're talking about. If we're talking about equal representation at the C-suite level, is this a societal problem or is this something that women need to step up? Right? I don't think it's fair to say that women need to step up. In general, I don't think it's fair to say that a whole demographic needs to step up because I think generally speaking, people try pretty hard. Right? I don't think that telling a gender or a race to step up is fair. Indian people need to step up, white people need to step up, black people need to step up. I don't think that that's fair at all. So do men have some responsibility in it? 100%. Do they have a lot of responsibility in it? 100%. So should you become more emotionally available? Absolutely. Should you boost your EQ? Absolutely. Will it improve your dating life and your professional life? Absolutely. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge that this is not all on the shoulders of the individual, right? As human beings, you can't blame an individual for a systemic issue. And the truth of the matter is when it comes to something as complex as dating, I don't think it's an individual issue or a systemic issue. And it's just as devastating for men or women or whoever else to say, oh, this is a society thing. There's nothing I can do. Let me throw up my hands. Oh, it's like I'm screwed by society, and absolve yourself of all responsibility and not try to actually improve yourself. The truth of the matter is that it's somewhere in between, right? So this is what we learned from tons of research in the field of medicine. Things are multifactorial. Bringing your cholesterol down, is that because your doctor isn't good enough or because you're not exercising? Answer is it's a little bit of both, right? There's shared responsibility. And what I'm seeing more and more in gender dynamics, and especially with things like dating and stuff like that, is that there's no shared responsibility. Everyone's always trying to punt the responsibility to everyone else. So men are trying to punt the responsibility to society, and society is trying to punt the responsibility to men. It's all your fault. You need to grow up. You need to step up. And on the flip side, there are people on the other extreme who's like, oh, like there's nothing I can do. And I think that's exactly why the problem persists. Do y'all get that? Like that's in situations where people share responsibility and like we as a society say we need to do more to support men, and as men say, hey, we need to do more to grow as individuals, that's when the problem is going to get fixed. But right now, all that's doing is we're passing the buck back and forth. And that's why the problem is getting worse. Questions? Chat wants to know how to boost EQ. I wish it were so easy. So let me kind of counter that question. So how do you boost IQ? Right? So it's like the interesting thing about human stuff, human behavior, human attributes, is the more global the attribute, the harder it is to operationalize how to improve it. Right? So how do you become more compassionate? It's challenging. So that's why we started by breaking things down into the 5 components of EQ, right? So are you aware of what you're feeling? Can you regulate what you're feeling? Can you communicate what you're feeling? Can you set aside what you're feeling? Are you aware of how your emotions influence your behaviors? Those are the 5 big domains of EQ. So we do believe that coaching will help with something like that. I imagine therapy will help with something like that. Although interestingly enough, the EQ research is predominantly not from the field of psychotherapy or medicine. A lot of the EQ research actually comes from the field of like business and like management and things like that. So it's really interesting. But I think like that's where those are the 5 steps. We're going to give you all an example later when it comes to shame about how to do that. So we'll give you all an example in a second. What do you have to say about EQ not really being real as far as it not being a scientific term, but one coined by a journalist who wrote a book in the late 90s, early 2000s? I think it's a valid perspective. So that's where, as you look at how the research has progressed, people took the term EQ and they tried to figure out, okay, is this a real thing that maps onto something that is scientific and measurable? And in that research, which once again, remember, comes out of management and stuff, so that stuff is like a little bit different, right? So it's what we've actually found is that there are domains of EQ which are scientifically valid. So awareness of emotions is absolutely a scientifically real thing. The ability to regulate your emotions is absolutely a real scientific thing. The ability to be empathic is absolutely a real scientific thing. So I think the cool thing about EQ research is that it may have been coined by a journalist in the business types, right? And I already said that most of it actually doesn't come from science. It comes from the business world. And then what's happened over the last 20 years is that scientists, as more and more people have been looking at it, they've been trying to figure out, okay, what part of EQ is actually real and not real? And that's why when we talk about EQ and emotional availability, what we try to do is share with y'all the scientifically valid versions of EQ, which are the subdomains. It's a good, does that sort of make sense? So like journalists may have stumbled upon it and then people thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. And they started doing management trainings and things like that. And it seemed to help. And then researchers got curious and they're like, wait a minute, but what is this? Is it real? And then they tunnel down into it. And these are the discoveries that they made that I personally think are valid, which is why we share it this way. Okay. Okay, let's move on to how to lower IQ. Spend time on Twitch, YouTube, and playing video games. All right? Okay. So, since people are asking about EQ, let's take a look at something else. Wow. Need dark mode chat. All right. Let's talk a little bit. So people are kind of curious, okay, like all this stuff with EQ and emotional quotient. Like if let's say I struggle with shame, like how do I actually improve my understanding of shame? How do I kind of conquer shame? So let's take a look. Okay, hold on a second. Get some water. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about shame. So 31M feeling ashamed for a lack of success. TLDR, what does great progress look like for someone who suffers from shame? What else can I do to further reduce or eliminate feelings of shame? I, 31M, understand my shame is something tied to my ideal self and where I would be at my age. Earn X dollars as monthly recurring revenue, earn Y dollars as a salary for my job. It's tied to some peculiar behaviors such as crunching numbers repeatedly on things relating to money, such as investments, monthly recurring revenue, cost of employees, etc. Seemingly shy away from others I perceive as more successful or have their crap together better than I. I've been practicing Om breathing exercises, and it seems to dissipate my emotional shame. When I'm not at a place where I can Om out loud, I can mentally rehearse. This meditative practice has helped me feel better. However, I want to take things to the next level. Dr. K's videos on shame for those who might need it, why shame is the raid boss of emotions, and how to overcome shame and feeling like a failure. I still feel myself freezing up from time to time. I lost my job 2 months ago and 2 key clients. I've had what seems to be depressive episodes about it and also some issues with other matters. I still have clients. I'm on EI. I'm not sure what that is. Employment insurance, maybe? Things are fine so far, so maybe I'm not as bad shame as I think I am. My definition of success seems to be screwing me up. Besides practicing Om exercises, taking showers, grooming myself, and clean my home whenever these episodes or emotions hit hard has also helped. Taking care of things I've been putting off in my personal life too. I seem to neglect my personal life, including taxes, my romantic relationship, and taking charge of my home, what I want it to be with my fiance. What would progress look like for someone struggling with freezing up with shame? Where you, as I would describe, have gotten over the initial hump and handling the shame to some degree, plus want to really silence the emotional shame from yourself, to do an excellent job managing it, which is the reasonable possibility. I'll keep practicing what works for me and trying new things. I'm just not sure what to expect over time and whether there is something different I need to do, like forming an accountability group for business owners. Any and all inputs greatly appreciated. So here's the tricky thing about shame. Sometimes we feel ashamed of ourselves. And much like this person, if we introspect, and this person has done a lot of good work, we sort of recognize that we have this idea of our ideal self, right? There's a version of me who would be making this much money, would be doing particular things, and I just don't live up to that standard, so I feel ashamed of myself. And then I shy away from other people who I think live up to that standard, right? Because sometimes what we hate the most is someone who succeeds at the things that we want to do but aren't able to. And so spending time with certain people just makes you feel more ashamed of yourself because you're trying to live up to this standard. The tricky thing here is that as we try to live up to this standard, we actually will do a lot of work, right? So sometimes as we start to make progress on the shame, we start meditating a lot, we start to, because like here's the ideal self, here's me. And I want to catch up to that, right? So I need to start doing better, doing better, doing better, doing better, doing better. Because that's how you fix shame, right? The antidote to shame is achievement, right? If I made that much money, I wouldn't feel ashamed of myself anymore. Something subtle here, something very tricky, because we all think that the antidote to shame is achievement. Because I'm ashamed because I don't achieve. So if I achieve, I'll be totally fine. But if you'll pay attention to this post, you'll see a couple of interesting things. It seems like the person is engaged. Seems like they're a business owner. Seems like they lost a couple of clients, but they still have a couple of clients. And if you also pay attention, they also crunch the numbers over and over and over again. And I wouldn't be surprised if this person moves the goalposts, right? Because sometimes when we're ashamed of ourselves, there's this ideal self, and no matter how we calculate, we never live up to the ideal. And so the really tricky thing about being ashamed of yourself is that you think that the way to solve it is by achievement. But the tricky thing is that achievement, and we'll explain how, actually reinforces the shame. So let's try to understand this, okay? The first thing to kind of look at is that shame operates in our self in different ways, okay? So this person does a good job of this where they sort of say that, okay, I meditate and that dissipates my emotional shame. So sometimes, if we look at shame, there seem to be different levels of emotional shame. So one of the levels is emotional. And what does that mean? That means that at times I experience an acute emotion, right? So I have particular thoughts in my head, my chest starts to constrict, I have a lump in my throat, I feel like fleeing somewhere, I hear that someone more successful than me is going to be at this party, and I feel embarrassed to go, and so I tighten up, I freeze up, and there's like this very acute, in the moment, experience of emotional shame. Now, and then this person has said, okay, so I've started meditating, I do Om chanting, props, and that's helped with that. But it doesn't seem to fix the other stuff, right? So meditating it away, like the problem isn't fixed. And that's a good point. It's an excellent observation. And this is what I really love about these posts in this community is y'all are learning the original tricks. And now what you're learning is that the problem is more complex. So it turns out that shame is way more than an emotion. So let's start to understand what are the other components of it. So there is identity. Okay? So what does that mean? So if we go back to the post, ideal self. So I want y'all to pay attention to this, okay? So let's take a look. So here's my ideal self, which earns X number of dollars per day, and here's my current self. The gap between these two things is where the shame comes from. Let's say I'm currently earning $8, okay? Do you all see that? So as long as this ideal self exists, the shame is a gap between where you are now and where you think you should be. If these two things were the same, there would be no room for the shame, which makes perfect sense. Because that's why I think that achievement is the answer. Right? Because achievement is how I go from my current self to my ideal self. The tricky thing is that's not quite how it works. The tricky thing is that achievement actually reinforces the problem. Let me explain to y'all why. So the idea of an ideal self is not a real thing. You can't be perfect. You're never going to be perfect. Right? So even if if you're here, let's say, and this is what's so tricky about shame. Oh, it's not. Okay, whatever. Busted. Scuffed. So we have our current self. we have the ideal self. And this, by the way, is born of ahamkar from the Sanskrit, okay? And achievement is what gets us from here to here. But if you look at people who are ashamed of themselves, there's something very, very tricky going on in this thought process, which is that we tend to move the goalposts. And what we're going to do is look at this person's thought process, and this is the third dimension that we're going to talk about, how the thoughts of shame exist, okay? So we're going to look at these thoughts very carefully. So I'll tell you all why I think achieving the ideal is an impossibility for this person. So, feeling ashamed for lack of success. What does great progress look like? Suddenly, progress isn't enough, right? So this person has made progress. They started doing Om chanting. They're dealing with their emotional shame. And do they feel proud of themselves? No, no, no. They need great progress. Do you all see that? It's subtle. So here's what happened. There was their current self. They felt X amount of shame. They started meditating. They got better. And did they feel proud of themselves? They say, good job, pat on the back. I've taken one step forward towards conquering my shame. No, 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 no. So then the ideal self gets moved down here. And now I have more stuff to do, right? This was insufficient. And we can see this in other places as well. Crunching numbers repeatedly on things like money, relating to money investments. So what I think is going on here is that if they make X number of dollars, as we crunch the numbers, because we feel ashamed of ourselves, as this becomes X, this is going to become Y. You all see that? So the tricky thing about shame is that it's built on this idea of an ideal self. It's this idea that, like, there is this perfect version of you out there, and you should be ashamed until you reach that point. The problem is that in that kind of situation, no amount of achievement is ever going to work, because you still have this idea of the ideal self, which is going to be moved around, or you're going to keep moving the goalposts, right? So the interesting thing is that what we know about shame is not about achievement, but actually getting rid of this entirely. This is the next step. It's not just an emotion. It's about acknowledging that the shame comes from a gap between where you believe you should be and where you are. And that actually letting go of that ideal self, being able to say, oh, like, there's actually, like, it's not, the antidote to shame is not achievement. It's acknowledging and realizing and having compassion that there's no reason to be ashamed to begin with. So I'll give you all just a simple example of this. You may sound like, that's insane. If you're ashamed of yourself, what do you mean achievement won't work? That's ridiculous. Like, I need to achieve more. So I'll give you all a good example of this. Sometimes kids who are in abusive situations, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, feel ashamed of themselves. Now, do you think that this is something that they can achieve their way out of? No, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. When a child feels ashamed because they're being abused, the antidote is not them doing a better job. But that's what they try to do, right? If y'all have worked with people or heaven forbid, you've been through abuse yourself, you know that even if one of your parents is emotionally abusive, you try really, really, really hard to make them happy and achieve, be a good boy or a good girl, be the person that be a good kid for your parents. And there's no way that that's going to work. The solution to that in therapy is going to be in acknowledging that, like, you don't need to achieve anything. That you're actually great the way that you are and you have no reason to be ashamed. I mean, there's good reasons why you feel that way, but like that's actually not a correct way of looking at your situation. And we sort of see this from a yogic perspective as well when we kind of look at this concept of ahamkar, right? This concept of ahamkar is the I feeling. or the ego. And the solution to that, the way to get free of your ego is not to satisfy everything that your ego wants. So if I want to be the richest person on the planet, or I want to be the sexiest person on the planet, that one already done, right? So I can attest to that. That doesn't satisfy you. You need more, right? So that's not how it works. Like achievement the ego is always going to want more. Like you always want another promotion. There's always going to be something going on. The ego loves to move goalposts. So what we need to do is actually abandon that ideal self. And that's where it's like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but like, what does that mean, abandon the ideal self? That means that accept who you are, right? That's what when we talk about accepting, it's like, okay, so I didn't make that much amount of money. This is like where I can improve, because you can definitely improve. We're not saying stop improving. But there's a difference between taking one step forward and one step towards an unreachable goal. Both of them are one step, but they feel very different. One of them is progress. The other one is completely insufficient. You all get that? And so one is going to make you feel more ashamed, and one is going to make you feel proud, even though the step is the same. So did you clean more than tomorrow? Than yesterday? That's something to be proud of. Whereas if I think, oh my God, I haven't cleaned anywhere near enough, cleaning a little bit is not enough. So you beat yourself up and feel ashamed. And then think about what you're doing. Progress becomes something for you to be ashamed of. And then how are you ever going to get out of that situation? When actual progress makes you feel ashamed, you're screwed. Y'all get that? So you have to let go of that ideal self. There is no ideal self. There's just you. And once you realize that, you'll realize something even is the beginning. It's terrifying. You're like, what do you mean there's just me? What do you mean there's no perfect? There ain't no perfect version of you. There's just you. You know what's an even more terrifying thought? The version of you that there is good enough. What does that mean, good enough? That doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? The good enough version is the perfect version. The only version of me that's acceptable is perfection. And as long as you believe that, how is achievement ever going to fix it? Just think about it for a second. The only version of me that's good enough has to be perfect. Well, you're like kind of screwed there. Like that's an unwinnable game that you're setting up for yourself. So this is a subtlety about shame, is that what we automatically think is that the gap between the ideal self and the current self, if we achieve that gap, if we bridge that gap, that's how we're going to be successful. But that isn't the case. Make sense? It's okay to have ideals. It's okay to move towards things, but it starts with acceptance. So the third dimension of shame that we're going to talk a little bit about is the thoughts, okay? So the other thing that you can do is catch the thoughts of shame. So we shared one with you, but we're going to look at them, right? So I love this word, subtle. Hold on, I can't see this. So let's start by catching the thoughts. Catch the thought of shame. So you'll see that something about your thought process sets you up for failure. And it's little words like this. What does great progress look like? Hold on a second. So what does great progress look like for someone who suffers from shame? It's this concept of great progress, right? That's a thought that is born of the shame, because progress is no longer enough. So we see this crunching numbers repeatedly on things relating to money, investments, monthly recurring revenue, et cetera, right? So you're going to constantly be changing the way that you look at things. And, it's subtle, but there's little things that are kind of baked in throughout this kind of thing. So, for example, they feel like they're neglecting their personal life, they're neglecting their taxes, their romantic relationship. I'm not saying that they couldn't be doing better, but they also have a fiance. They run their own business. They're meditating every day, right? So there's a subtlety in the way that your thoughts will actually construct ways for you to fall short. And that's what you need to be really careful about. Is that shame manifests in the standards that you hold yourself up in. It manifests as your actual individual thoughts, right? And then the last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is this concept of a samskar, or a shame complex. So we talk about this concept of samskars in Dr. K's guide. We have videos about them, etc. So y'all can check that stuff out. But I think this is where, why does this ideal self stuff happen in the beginning? It starts from somewhere, right? Somewhere along the way, you learned the lesson that being you is not good enough. Fundamentally, that's where all shame comes from. This idea that being you is not good enough. And so how do you fix that? One way to fix it, so you can work on the emotions in the present, you can catch some of the thoughts, you can work on your sense of identity, you can do all those kinds of things. The other thing is that, honestly, you can go to therapy. So a lot of toxic shame work can be done in therapy. And what you're trying to do in therapy is you're trying to sort of digest this shame complex. Where did you discover that what you are isn't good enough? And so one of the key things about shame that we kind of see here, so this person does a great job of sharing that you can be 31 and ashamed of your lack of success. And it turns out that when most people feel ashamed, what they try to do is achieve their way out of it. Right? Because if I'm ashamed of my achievements, then if I achieve more, I won't be ashamed. The tricky thing is that despite progress and achievement, what we oftentimes find is that the shame actually doesn't get better, which is very strange because we thought we could achieve our way out of it. And why does that happen? For a couple of important reasons. The first is that we tend to move the goalposts for ourselves. And so that's another thought that you can catch. The second is that the idea of the shame is born out of the ideal self, right? Because shame is the gap between where you want to be and where you are. And as long as this dichotomy exists, the shame will live in the middle. So even as I move forward, right, I'm going to move further and further away. The ideal self grows and changes. So you can't have shame without the ideal self. And so that's the identity aspect of shame. There's an emotional aspect of shame, which this person has done meditation and things like that. And then you can actually catch the manifestations of this shame complex in your mind with little things like great progress, right? So here's the key thing is ask yourself why the progress isn't enough. And your mind will give you lots of answers. And then notice the answers. And then start to notice, will this part of my mind ever be satisfied? If I did more, would it be satisfied? If I cleaned tomorrow, would it be satisfied? If I cleaned the next day, would it be satisfied? If I did my taxes, would it be satisfied? No. Because all of those thoughts are born out of the shame complex. And that shame complex or a samskar is something that you can eventually get to the root of. So that's when you're working with someone, usually. I mean, people do this in yoga ashrams as well, where they'll get to the root of their samskars. But that's where I think therapy is probably the best thing, to get to the root of that shame complex. Now, a lot of this stuff coaching can help with. I'd say especially, if you're like this person and you are concerned that you could be suffering from depression or something like that, absolutely go see a licensed mental health professional. But our coaches are taught this model. And the key thing that they really focus on is not just digesting the shame. It's about helping you understand your thought process and not let shame get in the way of your goals. So for example, I would expect coaches to help with something like this. Shying away from others I perceive as having their crap together or better than I am, right? So they're behavioral things that shame may be getting in the way of. And so if your shame is getting in the way of stuff, then coaching is good. Not a bad idea to get a mental health evaluation though, if you're kind of in this boat. Because sometimes shame can be a manifestation of negative self-attitude that is part of a mental health condition that requires treatment. Okay? Okay. So Shadow7578 is saying, I know that the root are my parents, but what's next? How do you deal with the root? So in my experience, sometimes we think we know what the root is, but we may be surprised. So I would say, in fact, the majority of people that I've worked with, and even the majority of people in the coaching program, our coaching clients, have discovered that the root that they thought it was is actually somewhat different than what they conceptualized. Because it's not just your parents, right? It's the shame is not your parents. It's which of your parents' beliefs did you internalize? Because you keep it alive. And understanding that is very important. So the next step would be sort of not just the parents, but what did you start to believe about yourself because of what your parents said? Or why did you start to believe it for yourself? Does that make sense? So it could be a different root. I mean, sometimes it's like people think they know what the root is, but that's why working with someone else can be very helpful. Okay, we've got time for one more, and we're almost out of time today, so we're gonna move on. I'd love to do questions, but this one's just too good. Okay. Just get water and rest my voice for a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So next up, we're going to talk about being a filler friend. Does anyone else feel like a filler friend? Like you just sit there, never contributing to the conversation, and when you do, no one notices. You don't really have a purpose or do anything and kind of just sit there existing. No one ever invites you ever or asks to do anything with you. And people even make group plans right in front of you and neglect your presence. It's not that anyone means for this to happen. It just kind of does. So this is tricky. Because sometimes we're just kind of like a placeholder friend, filler friend. Sometimes we exist within social circumstances that we're not really like a part of the group. So we exist in the group or maybe with the group, but we're not really a part of the group. And the tricky thing about this, like what makes this hard is that like, you know, the group isn't really including you. So it's kind of like they're not being nice, like they're not making an effort to include you, or sometimes you feel ignored because sometimes you're not speaking at all and sometimes you say a little bit and your words get ignored. But then the really tricky thing is like, what do you do about it, right? Because you can't go to a group and say, hey, y'all aren't including me. Like, they're not going to magically be your friend if you're like, hey, you're leaving me out, right? Like, and then the other thing is that sometimes we're kind of aware that it may not just be the group's fault. That sometimes it's like, actually, like, there's got to be something maybe that we're doing. We're kind of aware, right? Maybe we're a little bit socially anxious. Maybe we don't really participate in the conversation. Maybe we're like really worried about what participation in the conversation will look like. So being a filler friend is tough because you're not sure, you can't really hold the group accountable, and it's not entirely your fault, which then gets us into the problem of like, okay, how do I fix it then? Because this is a problem, right? I can't go up to people and say, hey, be my friend, asshole. Start including me. Because like, that's not going to work. And then, but you're not really sure like how to fix it. So we're going to go over a couple of things that are a little bit tricky. Because I think largely in this situation, what I tend to find is that there's a lot that you can do that oftentimes we don't do. So the first thing that we're going to try to understand is group dynamics. So I'm going to ask you all a question. Let's say there's a group of 6 people that are talking about stuff. And one of them is like, hey, do y'all want to go do something on Friday? We should totally do that. Yeah, I'm totally down. What do you think is the most important thing in a group of like 6 people that determines who gets invited or who comes along? So I would say this is where perceived interest, so people are saying status, but it's perceived interest, right? So like, just think about that for a second. Think about who you would invite. When you're thinking about who to invite, like when do you invite people and when do you not invite people? Right? Do you like look at, oh, this person has the highest social status in the group, so let me make sure to invite them. Think about when you would invite people. Or you're like, oh, like that person's rich and this person is poor. Screw that poor guy. I'm going to invite the rich guy or girl. Right? Easiest to be around. People are saying that. Some people are saying invite everyone. I don't invite boring people. So I think the most important thing for invitations is perceived interest. Or maybe it's not the most important thing for invitations, but it is one of the things that I think people who don't get invited to stuff consider. So the next thing that I want you all to think about is when you don't get invited to something, how would someone else in that group perceive your interest in doing the activity? And what we tend to find, if we want to be a little bit careful here, like you just sit there never contributing to the conversation. And when you do, no one notices. So if someone is in the group and never contributing to the conversation, what do you think that does for their perceived interest? Or when they communicate, they don't really they contribute a little bit, but not much. So there may be situations where people aren't inviting you because they're toxic or they're not very friendly or things like that. But that's like, we can't really control that. Whereas we've got to think about, okay, what can we control and what can we possibly do? And I'd start with this idea of perceived interest. And so you've got to think critically about, is the group that you're in, would they perceive that you're interested in going along? Because if there's like, one person, like if we're all talking about going to an anime convention, there's one person who's sitting there and hasn't said a word, would I invite them to the, like, they must not be interested in anime, so why would I invite them to the convention? It's kind of interesting. So think a little bit about your their perception of your interest in the activity. And the next thing we're going to talk about is participation. So how do you make it so that they see your interest? You have to participate. And that's where if you're not saying much, you're not participating much. So how do you participate? Why don't you participate? Let's start with the second one. First thing is that we talk about participate. Participation is tough, okay? Let's be clear. Participation ain't easy. It's like, I'm not even that into anime, but I watch a little bit of it. And I'd like to go and do it. It sounds interesting. Sometimes we don't participate because of how people will perceive us, right? If I participate and people don't listen, or if I participate and no one cares, like what if no one cares? Like what if this, what if this, what if this? So the second thing that I want you to ask yourself is, do you not participate because of the what ifs? If I say this, what if they don't like it? If I say this, what if they don't invite me? If I say this, what if they don't think I'm cool? If you've got a case of the what ifs and it's paralyzing your participation, that's really tricky. Because as you don't participate, they don't perceive interest and you don't get invited. So what do you do with that? You can go see a therapist and work on your social anxiety, sure. But there's actually like a couple of simple techniques. I'm going to teach y'all what I call like kind of the 1-2 punch of benign participation, which gets me into all kinds of trouble. So I use this trick all the time. I sort of do it a little bit reflexively, and then I wind up in conversations that I don't want to be in. Like I'll use this 1-2 punch almost reflexively when I'm sitting next to someone on an airplane. The next thing I know, they're talking to me about their life. And it's like, well, I just want to play Nintendo Switch. So it works really well. All right, so the 1-2 punch is that when someone says something, you make a comment and then you follow up with a question. The comment should be essentially a reflection or a reaction to what the person is saying, followed by an inquiry about ambiguity. Okay? I'll give you all a simple example. I love anime. Reflection or reaction, anime is dope. Followed by inquiry that resolves ambiguity. Which anime do you like? Okay? I know it's complicated terms. We're going to use them again. So first is a reflection or a reaction. And second is dig into ambiguity. It's a response. Asking a question that is digging into the ambiguity. So if someone says, I like anime, which anime? Like, what are they talking about? Are they talking about current anime, old anime? Are they talking about hentai? Are they talking, like, what are they talking about? You know, like, who knows? So that's where you want to start, because if you just ask questions, if you just ask questions, it's going to feel like you're interrogating people. It's like, what anime do you like? Why do you like that anime? What's your favorite character? What's your favorite character's favorite hairstyle? Did you notice that like, which hairstyle do you like? Which clothing do you like? Which accent do you like? Which voice do you like? Right? That's going to feel like interrogation. So what we want to do is a reaction followed by digging into ambiguity. I love anime. Anime is dope. Anime is great. Which ones are your favorite? Got it? It's that simple. You just toss those suckers out like a couple times. You don't want to be like doing it all the time. So 15 to 20% of the time if you're in a conversation of 6 people, you just toss those out. Man, I've got a test on Friday. I hate studying for tests. What's your test in? Okay. Now let's practice, chat. I'm going home for Thanksgiving. What's the reaction? What do y'all think? All right, and some people are saying, are you going to see family? Homes are dope. I don't care. I hate your home. Why are you going? Cool, looking forward to going home? Right? What's a home? What's Thanksgiving? Where are you going back to? I hate my family. I love turkey. All right, that's good. I think, so the tricky thing is that's a hard one. Because, it could be a mess or, and you can even say that. You could say like, wow, like, is that something to be celebrated or is that something to be like anxiety provoking? Because sometimes the holidays are awesome for me and sometimes they suck. That's the reaction. Right? Which one is it for you? Are you looking forward to it? Got it? Okay. Next thing. Hey, did you hear about the volcano erupting? What's the reaction? They're asking a question. Followed. Okay, so then what's... Yeah, perfect. No, what volcano? Volcanoes are dope. Can I come? Right? Wow, that's crazy. Wicked. Which volcano? No, that's wild. I didn't hear about that. Right? That's what she said. Don't use that's what she said. Volcanoes are dope. Which volcano? Yeah, so I guess this is turning into whatever they say. Just say that that's dope. And then ask another question, which works really well. Like, I want y'all to try this, okay? Just see how far you can get in a conversation by saying that's dope and asking a question, following it up. Are you going home for Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving's dope. Are you going home for Thanksgiving? Yeah, I am. I'm going to see my family. Families are dope. Is your family dope? Yeah, my family's pretty great. I have an awesome dog. Dogs are dope. What kind of dog do you have? See how far you can get. Yeah, and become an NPC in a conversation. I kid y'all not. So seriously, if you want to like learn how to basically participate in conversation, it's just the 1-2 punch. And here's the thing, if you're like with 5 people and you're doing it every 5th statement, you're not going to sound quite like an NPC, even though you are an NPC. Then I'm going to give you all one last tip. This tip is transformational, but is also terrifying. Are you ready for it? If you are in a group and people are making plans about stuff, and they don't seem to be including you, you can say, hey, that sounds awesome. Is it an open invitation? Is it cool if I come? You can just ask. And pay attention to your reaction to doing that. Right? Everyone's like, oh my God. And look who's got a case of the what ifs. We talked about the what ifs. Look at it. Look, you've got a case of the what ifs. That's why you're the filler friend. And if they say you can't come or it's not an open invitation, then that's totally fine, right? You know that these people are not interested in you. You're not stuck feeling like a filler friend. Asked and answered. Right? Fun past 1989 saying, I've never done that. Is it okay? Is it an open invitation? Can I come along? And people may think, oh my God, like who's this weirdo who's inviting himself? He's not inviting himself, or she's not inviting herself. She's just asking, can she come along? Open invitation. Right? And then here's the follow-up. If they say, yeah, sure, you can come. Cool. You can also you can kind of like double down. You can say like, I don't know if y'all are like friends and stuff. Like if you guys really, I'm curious, I'd love to learn more, but I don't want to be like a fifth wheel or anything like that. If you guys have like a thing going, like I wouldn't want to intrude, but I'm really interested. You can kind of like, if you're concerned that you may be pressuring, then they're like, no, it's fine that you can come. Right? And then you can say, cool. And so you can be a little bit forward. You can say like, okay, so like, how are we figuring, what are y'all doing? When are y'all going? Things like that. And then when you go, this is really, really important, right? Because remember, you're quiet and you've got a case of the what ifs. You start by saying, hey, thanks for inviting me. Or thanks for, setting this up. I really appreciate it. And then at the end of it, you want to say, hey, thanks. I really had a good time. Perceived interest. You got to reinforce it. Because if you're the quiet type and you don't really say much when you go, you at least want to say, hey, thanks for inviting me. I really had a good time. I'm on the quieter side. I hope that's okay. And then last tip, you ready for it? Smile. Hey, I'm on the quieter side. Thanks for inviting me, though. I really had a great time. May not seem like it. Like look, y'all see? We're teaching you how to be a better NPC. Smile. Perceived interest. Are you smiling? Smiling is dope. What makes you smile the most? All right, so you got to be a little bit careful because we don't want to be creepers. Right? We don't want to be, oh, you're going home for Thanksgiving? Where do you live? Can I come? Is it an open invitation? Don't put it together like that, chat. Don't put it together like that. That's bad. Okay? That's bad. Don't do that. The principles are correct, though. I recognize if stitched together in a particular way, you can make something that we're not talking about making. But I would say 90% of the time, this is totally fine. Oh, y'all are going paintballing? I've never been paintballing before. I'm probably going to get owned, but I'd love to try it. Is it okay if I tag along? Right? And then like you show up and then you're going to get owned and you're going to be like, hey, I kind of got owned. I'd love to do it again. I'm learning, but can we try to like balance the teams a little bit so I don't get owned so hard? Once again, smile, right? All right. So does that make sense? So common problem, people are filler friends. And I think the problem with being a filler friend is that we don't really know how to like break in. And we don't really understand why we're not getting invited. And the key thing, the most common reason that people don't get invited that is actionable that we're kind of talking about today, it could be things like status and stuff, like who knows. But in terms of what you can do, at least make sure that you can do the things that you're doing. And at the top of the list is your perceived interest, especially when groups are forming. It's different if something is like already formed. But even then, you can let people know explicitly what your interest is. Right? So it's perceived interest. How engaged are you? How do you be engaged in a conversation? Be careful about the what ifs. Oh no, what if they think I'm stupid? Or what if they don't like anime? Or what if they think I'm a weeb? Whatever. So notice that, and notice that's why you're not participating. And so very simple participation is the 1-2 punch. A reaction followed by a question. That is dope. What do you think is dope? What if I don't know what to say? That's what I'm saying is Code Monkey is an excellent question. What if you don't know what to say? That's what I'm laying it out, like what you say. It's a reaction. You can react to anything. Like, did you see oh, we're talking about the weather. Rained yesterday. Rain is dope. Yeah, it was like, it rained a lot. It hasn't rained in a long time. Sometimes I don't know if there's a follow-up question there. So if there's some kind of ambiguity, you can kind of dig into that. Okay, so this is a great question. DARCSS, Darks, is asking, what if you don't like small talk? It's a good question. So let's think through that. What if I don't like small talk? First of all, why don't you like small talk? So a lot of times the reason that people don't like small talk is because they don't know how to do it or they feel uncomfortable doing it. Right? Like a lot of times the reason that people don't like stuff is because they don't know how to do it properly. So that's the first thing is, are you good at it? Secondly, sometimes people don't like small talk because it feels fake, feels shallow, feels like there isn't a deep connection. And that's where you've got to decide, whether you want to play that game to get to the deeper stuff. Because most human beings have a dialogue tree. And you have to go through the upper levels of the dialogue tree to get to the deep levels of the dialogue tree. Right? Have you been to the Cloud District? I've heard it's very nice. Right? They don't just you don't walk up to people and they just give you a quest. I mean, sometimes they do in games nowadays. But that's just kind of the way that the world works. It doesn't have to work that way. And what I've also found is that you can also get good at skipping past a lot of the small talk. Because I don't know if you start to have you can get to a conversation about people's favorite animes and important themes in animes. You can do that in 3 questions. Anime is dope. What are some of your favorites? Oh, you really like Attack on Titan? I thought it was pretty epic. It kind of terrifies me, though. What did you like about it? Oh, okay. You liked the stuff. I sometimes really wonder, I really like how it has a very like mixed view of morality, right? So like at the very beginning, there's like a good guy and there's a bad guy, and it makes me really wonder about, you know, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and like, you know, it makes me really wonder about the world. And then you can have a conversation about morality, philosophy, and Attack on Titan if you want to. Right? Like, you can get to deeper stuff pretty quick. And then if you really don't like small talk, then the other question that I have for you is, okay, so you don't like it, but are you willing to participate in it to form connections and relationships and get invitations and things like that? Because people will say, I don't like exercise. Well, you don't have to like it. It's just what's important to you. Is taking care of your body important to you? And you can do something that you don't like. Does that make sense? It's a very common problem that people don't like small talk. People feel like it's not genuine. People sort of feel like it's shallow. It's a waste of time. I'm not disputing any of those things. It's just most people require some amount of small talk, right? So just get good at it. And you'll be surprised at how little small talk you have to have. I hate small talk, which is why when I interact with people, I try to advance the conversation to something that I can find interesting as quickly as possible. Right? It's not, and we've done that on stream like 1,000 times. right? So like, and what you'll find is that other people are interested in not having small talk too. You just have to give them an opening, and most people don't know how to advance the conversation. That's where you really have to become a conversation expert and advance the conversation. So what if you don't relate to the conversation that is happening around you? Great question. So if you don't relate to the conversation that's happening around you, one of the best things that you can do is be curious. So I have a group of friends who are all in the world of finance, and I don't understand what the hell they're talking about. So when I get bored of the conversation, I'll let them like trundle along for a little bit, 10 or 15 minutes of like me just not participating in the conversation. I'll be like, yo, can someone explain to me what on earth y'all are talking about? Can you tell me what an I bond is? Can you tell me, what crypto is? Can you tell me what Tether is? And if there's a group of people who are talking about something that you are not interested in, one of the best ways to participate in the conversation, because they're going to love this, they're going to love explaining it to you. Because the only thing that people like more than talking about a particular thing amongst themselves is explaining it to someone who's genuinely interested. Right? They're like, what on earth is an NFT? NFT is a digital whatever. I don't even know. And then it's like, wait, so what do people pay for? It's the future. The future is dope. What part of the future is it? They're like, it's the whole future. I don't understand. I understand the words coming out of your mouth, but I don't understand what you said. Can you explain to me how NFTs are the whole future? And this is where things get fun for you. Because this is where they start talking and they have no idea what they're talking about. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, just ask people. Like, I've never, I don't know anything about this. Can you all fill me in? Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And most people, just think about it. If you're passionate about something and someone comes and is like genuinely curious about it, you're going to be like, I'm not going to talk to you, noob. No, like most people love talking about it. We did an interview recently where someone was telling me about the nuances of a balance in a card game. And it was fascinating, man. It's like, I don't know anything about that. I don't know if y'all caught that interview. But you can just see how much people love talking about stuff they're interested in. It's cool to hear people talk about things that they're passionate about. Right? It's cool. Like, I learned something. Okay. We're at time for the day. We got to figure out any mods in chat. Okay, let's actually wrap up. So, being a filler friend is tricky. It's tricky, right? So this is the thing that we're sort of seeing is that, especially as we lean more on technology for communication, our brain is learning all of these attributes of communication that don't necessarily translate into group settings. So as we Discord more, as we Snapchat more, as we text more, we aren't getting a chance to practice our other communication skills. Now, some people may think that this makes us pathetic or whatever, and it's like, it doesn't make us pathetic. It's just our brain doesn't need to learn that stuff. And so sometimes what we need to do, especially if we spend a lot of time behind a computer, is we'll wind up as a filler friend, someone who's kind of around a group but not really part of it. And the good news is that you can actually do something about that, right? You can sort of make it known that you're interested, so that your perceived interest is going to correlate with the number of invitations you receive, and that's something that's absolutely controllable by you, as opposed to, for example, your wealth or your things like that. And rely on Andy Milanakis to talk about incorporating into group sex. Damn it, Andy. That's hilarious. I had not considered that at all. That's like the one thing where it's like, wow, that is dope. Tell me, where do you insert the... Oh, that's hilarious. It's so good, dude. Andy's a genius. Okay. And derailing, indeed. So who are we going to raid? Andy, are you streaming? Friend? Oh, we're gonna have to skip meditation for today. We're at time. Okay, who are we raiding then? Canut? Can somebody raid? We can raid Canut. Canute? Knut? Newt? Okay, do we have mods though? Because I still haven't figured out this login business. Otherwise, we just have to end stream and these 3,471 people are just going to have to GG. All right, we'll stream on Wednesday. By the way, so this kind of stuff, I don't know if y'all know this, but this is the kind of stuff that we do in Social Sandbox too. Like, this is like, so the internet is great at many things. And I love you brothers and sisters of mine on the internet very much, but sometimes we gotta like learn this stuff, right? Like, how do you talk to another human being? And honestly, that's what I had to do. I had to just like learn it. Like, I remember I started by reading How to Win Friends and Influence People. And like one of the rules in How to Win Friends and Influence People is smile. And I didn't realize, like, I don't smile when I talk to people. And then I started smiling. And then I sort of like practiced for a while, and I figured out that at the beginning, like, I was making robotic smiles. And those creep people out. And then there's the genuine smile, right? And the genuine smile sets people at ease. Maybe one day we'll do Dr. K's Guide to Smiling. Raid now. Tech Teller, dude. Go now. He just faked it. No. It wasn't a fake genuine smile. It was a genuine smile. That's the key. Is smiling involves cultivating a genuine emotion and then letting it show through on your face. So I just think about something happy. Like, I think about how much I like y'all, and then it just makes me smile. It makes me feel good on the inside. Right? It's like, cool. Y'all are so good. Such good humans out there. Just trying to, you're trying to live your life. Like, that's all we're trying to do. Just trying to live our lives. And like, it can be challenging, but it's beautiful too. Right? Get that? Does that feel fake to you? Smiling is dope. How do you like to smile? All right, y'all, take care.